A beautiful home, a loving couple, and a story that seemed like a fairy tale. But one night changed everything. A young woman was found dead in her own house. Her husband? A helpless victim or a cunning murderer? Caroline Crouch was a young woman full of life. She was beautiful, cheerful, and always looking for adventure. During a trip to Greece, she met Babish Anagnostopoulos, a charming helicopter pilot. Their meeting was pure coincidence, but soon it turned into a deep connection. Babish treated Caroline with love and care. He paid attention to the little things, listened to her every word, and always made her feel special. Caroline felt like she had finally found the missing piece of her life. Before long, they decided to get married. Babish promised her a lifetime of love, protection, and happiness. Caroline believed him with all her heart. Their wedding was a dream come true. Smiling faces, heartfelt vows, and the hope of a beautiful future together. But no one knew that this love story would one day turn into a nightmare. After their wedding, Caroline and Babish started their new life together. They moved into a beautiful home in an upscale area of Athens. Caroline believed this was the beginning of a perfect life, one filled with love, happiness, and a strong bond between them. But as time passed, things started to change. At first, Babish was the same loving and caring husband. He showered Caroline with attention, made her feel special, and gave her the life she had always dreamed of. But gradually, his behavior became different. He would get irritated over small things, speak harshly, and sometimes his eyes held a strange coldness. Caroline noticed the shift, but tried to ignore it, believing that every marriage had ups and downs. A few months into their marriage, Caroline discovered she was pregnant. She was overjoyed and hoped that this new chapter would bring them even closer. Babish also seemed happy at first, but soon his attitude became more controlling. He wanted to know her every move, who she talked to, and where she went. Caroline, once a free-spirited woman, started feeling trapped in her own home. As her pregnancy progressed, arguments became more frequent. Caroline confided in her diary, expressing her growing fear and frustration. She still loved Babish, but something felt wrong. She didn't know it yet, but she was stepping into a dark and dangerous path, one that would lead to a tragic ending. Caroline had always been independent and full of life, but after her marriage, she slowly began to feel trapped. At first, she ignored the small signs, Babish checking her phone, questioning her about her whereabouts, and insisting that she stay home more often. She told herself it was just his way of showing love. But over time, his control over her became suffocating. During her pregnancy, Caroline started feeling more isolated. Babish no longer treated her the way he used to. He decided who she could talk to, where she could go, and even what she could do in their own home. Caroline missed her freedom, her friends, and the simple joys of life. She wrote in her diary about feeling like a prisoner in her own house. One evening, after an argument, Caroline locked herself in a room. She had started resisting Babish's control, and he didn't like that. She texted a friend, saying she felt scared and didn't know what to do. But she still wanted to believe that things would get better. As days passed, Babish's possessiveness turned into anger. Caroline had once thought he was her protector, but now she wasn't sure if she was safe around him. She didn't realize that her attempts to break free would soon push Babish to do something unthinkable. She was running out of time, and she didn't even know it. Caroline's once happy home had turned into a place of fear. The man she had loved so deeply was no longer the same. Babish had become unpredictable. One moment, he was affectionate, apologizing for his anger, and the next, he was controlling and distant. She felt like she was living with two different people. Her diary entries became darker. She wrote about feeling suffocated, about how Babish wouldn't let her make decisions on her own. She was no longer allowed to leave the house without him knowing. Even at home, he would check her messages and ask her why she was talking to certain people. The freedom she once enjoyed was gone. One night, after another heated argument, Caroline told Babish she wanted to leave. She couldn't live like this anymore. She wanted to take their baby and start fresh somewhere else. But Babish refused to let her go. He begged her to stay, promising that he would change. But Caroline knew better. She had heard these promises before. She secretly started planning her escape. She searched for flights back to the UK, thinking of ways to leave without him noticing. But Babish was watching her closely. He sensed she was slipping away, and he wasn't going to let that happen. Caroline didn't know it, but the walls were closing in. The man she once trusted the most was about to become her worst nightmare. Caroline was determined to leave. She had endured months of Babish's control, but now she could no longer ignore the fear growing inside her. She wanted to escape, not just for herself, but for her baby. She had secretly looked up flights and confided in a close friend, telling them she was scared of what Babish might do if he found out. But Babish was already suspicious. He had noticed her distancing herself, her sudden silence, the way she avoided looking him in the eyes. One night, as Caroline lay in bed, she sent a message to a friend. "I can't do this anymore. I want to leave." She had no idea that this would be one of her final messages. The next morning, the tension in the house was unbearable. Caroline tried to act normal, but Babish could sense something was wrong. That night, another argument broke out. Caroline, fed up with his manipulation, finally told him, "I don't love you anymore. I want out." Babish snapped. His worst fear was coming true. Caroline was slipping away. He begged, he yelled, but she stood firm. She was leaving no matter what. As the night grew darker, Babish sat in silence, his mind racing. He couldn't let her go. If he couldn't have Caroline, no one could. The next few hours would change everything. The house was silent, but the air was thick with tension. Caroline had made up her mind. She was leaving, and nothing Babish said could change that. She lay in bed, her heart pounding, knowing that tomorrow she would take the first step toward freedom. But she didn't realize that Babish had already made his decision too. As Caroline slept, Babish sat in the dark, his thoughts spiraling. He couldn't let her go. He had spent months controlling her, making sure she belonged to him. The idea of losing her made his blood boil. He wasn't going to allow it. Sometime in the middle of the night, Babish crept toward the bed. Caroline was fast asleep, unaware of the danger right beside her. Without hesitation, he grabbed a pillow and pressed it over her face. Caroline woke up in shock, struggling desperately to push him off. She kicked, clawed, tried to scream, but Babish was stronger. He pinned her down, holding the pillow tighter and tighter. Her body thrashed beneath him, her hands reaching out, but her strength was fading. The fight lasted only a few moments. Then everything went still. Babish sat there, breathing heavily, staring at his wife's lifeless body. He had done it. The woman he claimed to love was gone. But now, he had a new problem. He had to cover up his crime. And for that, he needed a perfect lie. Babish sat in silence, staring at Caroline's lifeless body. His hands were shaking, his heart pounding. He had done the unthinkable. But instead of regret, his mind was already racing. He needed to cover this up. He needed a story that would make him look innocent. He glanced around the room, thinking fast. Then, an idea formed. He would stage a robbery. He would make it look like intruders had broken in, killed Caroline, and tied him up. It had to be believable. He had no other choice. First, he ransacked the house. He pulled drawers open, threw things on the floor, and scattered valuables around to make it seem like a burglary gone wrong. Then, he did something even more disturbing. He went to their dog, Roxy, and killed it, hanging its body from the railing. It was a cruel act, but in his twisted logic, it made his story stronger. Next, he tied himself up. He wrapped tape around his wrists, loosely enough so he could free himself later. He lay down near Caroline's body and waited. Hours passed. He forced himself to cry, to look terrified. Then, just before sunrise, he called the police. His voice was shaking, desperate. "Please, robbers broke into my house. They killed my wife. Help me." Within minutes, the police arrived. Babish looked like the perfect victim. But what he didn't know was that his perfect lie wouldn't last forever. When the police arrived, they found a horrifying scene. Caroline's lifeless body on the bed, the house in chaos, and Babish tied up near her. He looked shaken, his face covered in fake grief. He told the officers a dramatic story of masked robbers who had broken in, demanded money, and, in their rage, killed Caroline before escaping. At first, the police believed him. It was a tragic and terrifying crime. The news spread quickly across Greece, and people felt sympathy for the grieving husband. Babish appeared on television, crying as he spoke about losing the love of his life. He held their baby in his arms, playing the role of a broken man. But behind the scenes, investigators were starting to see cracks in his story. Forensic experts noticed something strange. There were no real signs of forced entry. Nothing valuable was stolen, and the way the house was robbed looked staged. Even more suspicious was Caroline's smartwatch. It recorded her heart rate, and the data revealed that she had died much earlier than Babish had claimed. The biggest clue came from Babish's own phone. His movements didn't match his version of events. At the time he claimed to be tied up, his phone's activity suggested otherwise. Slowly, the police started putting the pieces together. Something wasn't right, and soon, the truth would come crashing down on Babish and Agnostopoulos. The police now had serious doubts about Babish's story. The so-called robbery didn't make sense. There were no real signs of forced entry, no fingerprint from intruders, and the stolen valuables were barely worth anything. But the biggest red flag was Caroline's smartwatch. Investigators discovered that Caroline's heart had stopped beating hours before Babish claimed the robbers broke in. This meant he had lied about everything. Meanwhile, data for Babish's phone showed movement inside the house when he was supposedly tied up. The evidence was piling up against him. Still, Babish continued his act. He attended Caroline's funeral, holding their baby in his arms, crying in front of cameras. The public saw him as a grieving husband, but behind the scenes, the police were closing in on him. A month after Caroline's murder, on the day of her memorial service, the police made their move. Officers approached Babish and told him they had new evidence. They asked Babish and Agnostopoulos had finally confessed. After weeks of lies, fake tears, and playing the grieving husband, he could no longer escape the truth. He had killed Caroline in cold blood, staged a robbery, and even murdered their dog to make his story more believable. When the news of his confession broke, the public was shocked. The man who had appeared on television as a heartbroken husband was actually a manipulative murderer. Caroline's family, who had once trusted him, were devastated. They had lost their daughter, and now they knew she had died at the hands of the man who claimed to love her. During his trial, Babish tried to justify his actions. He claimed that Caroline had been aggressive, that they had argued, and that he acted in a moment of rage. But the evidence showed otherwise. Caroline had wanted to leave him, and he couldn't accept losing control over her. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated murder. In 2022, Babish was sentenced to life in prison for Caroline's murder, plus an additional sentence for killing their dog. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Justice had been served, but for Caroline's family, no punishment could bring her back. Her diary, filled with dreams and fears, became a heartbreaking reminder of the life she never got to live. She had wanted freedom, but instead, she became a victim of the man she once loved. Caroline's story is a painful reminder of the dangers of toxic and controlling relationships. If you or someone you know is experiencing emotional or physical abuse, don't stay silent. Seek help, talk to someone you trust, and remember, love should never come at the cost of your freedom or safety. With Babish behind bars, the case of Caroline Crouch is legally closed. But her story will always be remembered as a tragic lesson about the dark side of possessiveness and control.